Hi and welcome back to The Active Listener. My name's Mark and this is where we listen, not just hear. Today we have an interesting subject. We're actually talking about suicide prevention. So just as a warning, this episode does include discussions of suicide. So please do look after yourself. And if you do need additional support, certainly here in the UK, you can call Samaritans on 116 123 or Papyrus on 0800 068 4141. For those of you that are outside of the UK, then please Google or at least reach out to someone that you know and love. You're cared for, you're not alone. But today, as I said, we're going to be talking about suicide. I think it's a really important subject, so please bear with us. So I would like to invite Claire. Hi, Claire.
Hi, nice to be here. Thanks, Mark.
Nice to have you here, and obviously this is your field of expertise. So before we move on, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you're involved in this area?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I'm Claire Harris. I'm a chartered health psychologist. I currently run a business called Promote Mental Health. We offer training and consultancy around mental health and wellbeing. So we offer mental health first aid training and bespoke training around self-care, stress, resilience, work-life balance. That training does include discussions around suicide. It's really important to have those discussions, so it's a key part of mental health first aid. I also work for CPSL, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough and South Lincolnshire Mind, where they have a stop suicide package that we deliver to support people around suicide prevention.
Brilliant, thank you. And it's interesting you say about suicide. It's one of those taboo subjects. In fact, death itself is something that's often taboo, and it's interesting, I think, really to talk about that and tackle that on. So why are we talking about the topic of suicide today?
Suicide, as you said, is really important to start having conversations about it. There's a huge stigma around it. We have got Suicide Prevention Day coming up soon, which is, I think, why we wanted to talk about this topic first. So the 10th of September, that's an annual Suicide Prevention Day. The theme this year is creating hope through action. So there are lots of organisations now that you can turn to. There are lots of campaigns looking at supporting people, but also how can we prevent suicide? So we can start to having those conversations means that people are more comfortable about talking about it. So we're much better now about talking about mental health. That has shifted. So I've worked in mental health for about 20 years now, within the NHS, within local authority and also within research. There has been a shift in the conversations. There's less stigma about talking about it, but suicide still has that, that term frightens people and people are worried to go any further with that conversation.
I think the thing that struck me actually is the fact that I've known people that have unfortunately taken their life. And someone I know relatively recently, in the last couple of years, there was kind of no signs, or rather we knew that in the past they struggled with sort of mental health issues, but up until the time they took their life, they hadn't mentioned anything. They were getting on with their job, and then the next thing you know, they're gone. And it's sort of thinking, obviously that's a shock. But from the little I know about the stats, they kind of fitted into that bracket. It was a man of a certain age. He was still young. But yes, it'd be interesting to know a little bit more really about how do you tackle that. I mean, we're talking about suicide. But on a daily basis, what do we need to be thinking about? What do we need to be aware of?
Yeah, I think the key thing is generally we need to change the culture around mental health and wellbeing. So we're having conversations about it, so it's more open, so that within the workplace, but also with friends and family, people feel more confident or feel more able to say, I'm struggling. There's that big thing now. It's okay to not be okay. That's kind of a new thing. It's a bit of a cliche. There is still that stigma with suicide, particularly men as well. We know rates are higher in men, so 75% of suicides are men. The reason for that is generally, men tend to not have those social networks often that women have. They tend not to be as open about their feelings, and then unfortunately they hit that crisis point more quickly. Also, when you were saying about the signs, I think Sometimes we don't see those, or they aren't there, but often people are kind of indifferent about suicide. So often it's very much about emotional pain. It's about wanting that emotional pain to end. And sometimes there are things we can look out for. Maybe sometimes we look back. There may be conversations we've had where that person has given an invitation, but we've missed it, or we've not picked up on it. So it may be explicitly saying things like, I just don't feel like I want to be here anymore, or people would be better off without me. Or it may be that they're kind of researching things or looking at things. Sometimes, like you said, we don't, there aren't signs, or we don't see those signs, or they're very hidden. So it's a very, very complex issue, and there's often not one trigger. It's very complex, and multiple issues in terms of someone getting to that place.
So Suicide Prevention Day, tell us a little bit about that. What's its purpose? How long has it been going for?
Yeah, I'm not sure how long it's been running for. I mean, the 20 years I've worked in mental health, it's been running. It's very much to raise the profile of suicide, but suicide prevention, things that organisations can do to put in place to make sure that people are aware of the support services. So signposting. So if someone does have that conversation with you, mental health first aid training is very much about that. It's how to have a conversation. It's about asking a direct question, not being frightened to do that, and then signposting that person to the appropriate service. We can't train everyone up to become a professional, but we can train people how to listen, which is why I wanted to have a chat to you, being part of the listening active listener. Honing in our listening skills, connecting with someone, being non-judgmental in that conversation, using empathy, and finding ways of signposting to services. We know services are stretched. We've got a very challenged mental health system, so we can go to professionals, we can signpost to things, but we also need to support people outside of that, because they may well be waiting for support as well. And I think Suicide Prevention Day is just continuing to raise the profile. It's something we're doing all the time. We don't just do it on September the 10th. It's something that I'm doing throughout my work and my training.
So it seems, thank you for that. It seems that it's really about prevention, in one sense, that people don't get to the point where they're seeing that suicide really is the only option. And I think there is still some work to be done, particularly around men. I think there have been steps forward, but there still is, and maybe it's the people of my generation. I don't make sound really old, but I still think there is that kind of, oh, I'll be right, mate. You'll be fine. Someone's leg can be hanging off. I'll be fine.
I'll be okay.
I'll be okay. So it's how do we kind of deal with that? I mean, there are any specific initiatives, for instance, from a male perspective?
Yes, there's a lot more being done to support men. It's interesting you were saying that, because I often say to my husband, goes running with a male friend. They run together, and I'll say, what did you talk about while you were running? Oh, we talked about running. Whereas I run with a friend, we talk about everything. I think men just traditionally generally have that very different relationships, and don't necessarily reach out. It's that stiff upper lip. The man needs to be strong. We are breaking through that a little bit. But suicide is the leading cause of death for men between 20 and 49. And it's there's high rates between 45 and 49, and the reason for that age is that kind of middle age where there's a lot of pressure. You might have a mortgage, you've got finances, you may well have dependents, children, families to support. You may well have been in a job for a long time and you kind of want out, but financially you can't change. So many reasons. As we said, it's very, very complex. We know that only 36% of the referrals to NHS services for talking therapy are men. So again, they're not accessing services, but we know generally people hit that crisis point and sometimes they've never been in touch with a service. And that's that men tend to hit that more quickly. In terms of support, there are lots of campaigns and there are lots of organisations. The one that comes to mind is Andy's Men's Club, or Men's Club, I think. We've got Andy's Man Club, that's it. It's all over the country in the UK. We do have one in Peterborough, Cambridge and Huntingdon. It's a peer-to-peer support group where men are just invited to come along. It's like a safe environment. Come and have a chat. I think a lot of people say often their first meeting, they probably just go and listen. They may not even say anything, but it's another way of kind of men to connect and have that emotional support when often perhaps they may not have that conversation with a mate.
Yeah, that sounds really good, isn't it? I think as well, you know, as you were talking earlier, it reminds me of often a phrase people will say is, "Oh, man up," about it. There's definitely that kind of view as to what a man is, you know, or should be. And I mean, that's a whole other podcast in its own.
It is.
Right.
Yeah.
So how would you recommend about approaching the topic of suicide with someone? How would you
I think, as we've come back to it already, I think listening is the key thing. Often when we have conversations, and I know we spoke about this before, we think about we're listening to reply rather than to listen to understand. So if we're having a chat with a friend, it's, you know, it might remind us of something that's happened to us or something that we want to add to the conversation. So we're kind of not really listening because we're waiting to add our bit to the chat. And so listening, active listening, is very, very different, where we're really listening to what that person's saying. Being non-judgmental is another form of kind of active listening. We make judgments when we see someone within about 30 seconds. And if we can be aware of our judgments of others, putting our kind of frame of reference, our view of the world to one side, which is challenging, it's quite hard to do. That helps us to be non-judgmental. And the empathy and connection, just that connection with someone. So it's very much about, you know, getting over those fears and worries about talking about the topic of suicide. I think so many, even today, I was thinking, oh, you know, I'm coming on this podcast. Am I the right person to do this? Am I, you know, should I be talking about suicide? So even as a professional, there's still that fear about having a conversation about it. But it's very much about challenging that and just starting to have a conversation. We know also that it's important through research, it's important to ask a direct question. And we train people to do that through mental health first aid training and other forms of training. So I remember when I started my first job in research working with children, I was doing assessments around suicide, and I was really worried about asking the types of questions. I had a standard questionnaire, and I remember talking to one of the key professors who was running the training, the course in Manchester, Professor Harrington, and I said, you know, if I'm going to ask these questions, is it not going to give the children, these young people, that idea? And he said, absolutely not. They know through years of research that it's not going to give someone the idea. They'll either be in that space or not. And I think if you ask a direct question, something like, are you thinking of taking your life? Are you having suicidal thoughts? If that person's not in that place, they'll tell you. They'll just say, that's not where I am. And it's not going to give someone that idea. So best practice is that we ask a direct question. And I think sometimes that doesn't come out right. You know, I've had to support close family members where it's come out in a bit of a muddle because that relationship's been very close, where I've said, you're not going to do something silly, are you? And then I've had to have another go because I know that really I have to ask directly about it. It is good practice to do that. And then once that person is starting to have a conversation, the listening skills are key, and then that's supporting that person to the right service, signposting across to the right service as well, and not being afraid to have those conversations.
So there's something there about being honest, about knowing yourself and to be aware, really listening and also being brave enough to ask often awkward questions, which people themselves can find difficult. But then there's also, how do you respond? How do you respond to someone? I remember years ago, I used to be involved with a counselling charity, and someone phoned up and basically said, look, they were looking at what options to use to take their life. And this was like the first time. It's like, okay, and you know, and it's like, where do you go with that? If you have a good friend or indeed a colleague who says, you know, they're struggling and they're thinking about taking their life, and you're not a trained counsellor, where do you begin? What do you do with something like that?
I mean, the best thing is, if you're interested in this area, is to go and get some training. So in mental health first aid training, what we teach is that you ask a direct question, because the only way you're going to find out if someone's suicidal or not is to ask directly. And then to listening skills, as we come back to, is key, but finding out where that person is on that level of risk. And training will help you do that. You know, if you're not trained, if you haven't gone on a course, you can still have a conversation. So a colleague of ours who does a lot of training now, Johnny Benjamin, he was sat on Westminster Bridge quite a few years ago now. He had decided he'd come out of hospital, decided he was going to take his life that day. Someone called Neil stopped. So he was sat there in rush hour. Most people were walking past, rush hour in London. Everyone's thinking, oh, that's someone over there, I'm not going to get involved. Neil had no training in mental health at all. He went over and said, mate, are you okay? They started to have a dialogue, started to have a conversation, realised they grew up in a similar area, like common ground, and talked Johnny down. So there was no kind of training that he had at the time. It was just about that human connection, but very much listening, responding back, finding out a little bit, you know, is that person in a place where they're in immediate danger now, and do we need to do something? Do we need to call a emergency service, or is this something that we can phone a phone line together or support somebody to access services? So yeah, there's not really one response in answer to that, but you don't have to be trained to support somebody.
So I guess it's about being there, isn't it? You're walking through, supporting that person.
Yeah. And for people who are, you know, feeling, if, you know, someone is feeling suicidal or struggling watching this as well, you know, reach out for support. It doesn't have to be a professional. You know, there are phone lines. There's also text lines. So young people don't always want to phone up or speak to someone face to face. So we've got Shout, which is you text Shout to 85258. They will assign you a mental health professional on the other end who will text back. I recommend that in most training sessions, and I'd never text it. So about 2 months ago I did, and within about 10 minutes someone would text back saying, we are assigning you someone to chat to professionally. And then you just put opt out when you don't want to do that. So there are so many options to support somebody.
So Claire, if people want more information to understand a bit about what you do, what options there are for support, what's the best course of action?
Yeah, so for direct support for someone who is suicidal or struggling, there are a number of resources. So we've got Andy's Man Club, as we've talked about. Googling that, you'll find the localities where they offer that service. Samaritans 116123, they are open every single day, 24/7. So there's a phone line and I think also a text service. Papyrus is prevention around young suicide, and we mentioned that again at the beginning, 0800 068 4141. The text service, which again is really helpful, particularly for young people if they don't want to speak to someone, but would be happy to text, and that's texting Shout to 85258. We're really lucky. Certain areas of the NHS in this country most people have a crisis line, but in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough we have a separate option. So if you phone 111, you can choose option 2. That gets you through to our first response team, who have trained professionals around mental health. So again, that's another route you can phone for yourself or for somebody else. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a professional line. If somebody is struggling or you're concerned about them, ask direct questions. If you're that person who is finding things very, very difficult, reach out to anybody. Just start having that conversation, because there will be someone who can help you and can listen. In terms of training, so if people are interested in learning more about mental health, so Promote Mental Health, we go into organisations to deliver mental health first aid, which has training included in how to support someone who's suicidal. That's evidence-based and nationally supported training. We also run bespoke courses around wellbeing as well. And Cambridgeshire and Peterborough and South Lincolnshire Mind, they offer a stop suicide training. They have a Stop Suicide campaign to support organisations, but that training again gives more detail on how to support someone if they're suicidal as well.
Brilliant, thank you. So there's a lot of options there, and indeed we'll put all that stuff in there, the blurb, yes. So you know people can look up and reach out if necessary.
Yeah,
but just to reiterate to anyone who's listening and maybe struggling at this time, please do reach out to someone. You know, people care, you are cared for, you have intrinsic value. And to you, Claire, thank you for what you do, and thank you for spending some time sharing on this, and hopefully we'll get to speak to you again soon.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.